So our topic for today, as well as for a couple of future days, are participles. And the general definition of what a participle is that it's a verbal adjective. To say that it's a verbal adjective means that you are using an action to describe a noun. Specifically today, we're talking about perfect participles. So we're talking about describing a noun by an action that has happened in the past. Make sense? To really get a handle on participles, we're actually going to go back to an old friend, the fourth principal part. Think about previous Latin experiences and tell me, what do you remember about the fourth principal part? You don't have to give me examples of fourth principal parts, unless, of course, you know one you want to throw in there. But what do you remember about it? What sort of qualities does it have? There are only 7 of you here today, but do want to make sure we hear from many voices, many of 7. Right.
Were they supposed to put it like that stuff?
No. It is used for the perfect passive system, have been loved. Right. So that's where we started to really get to know the fourth principal part back in December, where you had a 2-part compound verb. And it featured the fourth principal part, and then it featured a form of the verb to be. So perfect passive, this should actually be pluperfect passive, not imperfect. Neither here nor there. It is used when you translate passives. It commonly ends in US, absolutely. You would use the stem for a perfect passive by taking off the I. I think if you're thinking of an I, you're thinking of the third principal part versus the fourth. But you do use it for perfect passives. So your head was in the right place. Any other responses? Okay. One of the other things to keep in mind about the fourth principal part is that whereas it commonly ends in US, we saw in the perfect passive system that US ending is variable. Because if you had amata sum, you would say, I have been loved. But if Kunal said the same sentence, he would say amatus sum. So the ending of that fourth principal part will change, which is going to lead us into the new life of the fourth principal part. So from here on in, you shall know the fourth principal part as a perfect passive participle. P cubed, if you will. The fourth principal part, as we mentioned before, has a varied set of endings. It has any available ending from the first and second declension, which means that it has the potential to be an adjective. it can modify a noun. In the sense that it is a perfect passive participle, you are modifying it as an action that happened in the past, and because it's a passive participle, you're identifying it by an action that the noun itself did not complete. I've given you some examples of fourth principle parts. I've randomly chosen one from each conjugation. We have amatus, and then a translation is having been loved. You'll see that with these four examples, there is the same exact translation. It's called a stock translation. Has anybody read the Odyssey? Or reading it now? Okay. Do you know what a stock epithet is? Stock adjectives, yes. Adjective is the new version of epithet. Yes, so what is a stock adjective then?
It's when there are two adjectives in a row that describe the same.
Right, right. And in an epic poem like the Odyssey, you have the same adjective describing the same character throughout. That always kind of brings this image to mind. Odysseus has a lot of them, but I think one of them is like a city sacker or something like that. Raider of cities or something of that. Oh boy. Do you have a connection issue too, or is it just me? Oh, there we go. Thank you. Can you think of other stock adjectives from the Odyssey? You can look, that's fine. I won't tell your English teacher. Usually I think the major characters, like the gods and goddesses, they all have one. Poseidon, yeah, what is he?
Oh, no.
Anyone know what? Calypso is what? Lovely braids. Is that what you said? Okay, so Calypso, every time you see her name in the text, she is described as having lovely braids, so that you can always, when you think of Calypso, you think of lovely braids. When you think of Odysseus, you think of Raider of Cities or something. I think Poseidon is like Earthshaker, something of that nature. So every time you think of Poseidon, you think of Earthshaker. So every time you think of a fourth principal part of a verb, you should think of having been blanked, whatever the verb meant. All right, so we have the same version of a translation, it's just varied by the actual definition of the verb. Motus, having been moved. Positus, having been placed. Auditus, having been heard. Make sense? Okay. What is the fourth principal part of monere? See if you can figure it out, or remember it at least. Okay, the correct answer is monetus. Part of remembering the fourth principal part is that you have to remember the fourth principal part. You have to memorize verbs with all of their principal parts together. And we can't just make a seemingly logical assumption of whatever the fourth principal part is. You really, really have to know these inside and out. So the fourth principal part of monere is monetus. So now here's your chance to give a fourth principal part perfect passive participle translation of monetus. Ideally, I will see 7 of the same translation.
Deal.
That's the goal. It's a little pressure, I know, but
Oh.
I'd like to have all 7 responses in so we can see if we made our 100% goal. All right, let's see. Having been warned. Excellent. This is definitional, if you will, but at least you have the right motif. It's not move, because that would be motus. Having been warned. Good. All right, so here, in this particular definition, you have combined the translations of a verb with a participle. If you just stick to that prescribed translation, you will do really, really well with participles. If you know that any time that there's a fourth principal part, you should always just translate it having been blanked, having been blanked, having been blanked. I promise you, you will encounter great success with participles. But you shouldn't confuse them with verb forms because participles are adjectives. So we just want having been warned. Okay, good. So let's take a look at what these sentences, or what a sentence would look like if it were to have a perfect passive participle in it. Remember, a perfect passive participle is using a noun, or using an adjective, to describe a noun by an action that happened in the past, which makes it perfect, and the action happened to it by something else. The first one, the chair, having been moved, blocked the door. I gave you the Latin of sella mota. So the chair is being described as having been moved. It did not do the moving, and the moving is not happening now. It already happened to it in the past. Another example, the audience turned to the little girl having been heard, finally. So the little girl is described as having been heard. She did not do the hearing, other people heard her. So it's a passive participle, and it's in the past. At her birthday, we gave endless praise to my mother, having been loved for years. My mother is the one who is described as having been loved. She didn't do the loving, in this sentence at least. And the love has happened in the past. It's not happening right now, at least in this current description. And then our final example, I was tripped by the chair having been put too close to my desk. The chair didn't put itself there, and the putting happened in the past. The chair is not being put there right this second. Do you sort of understand the general premise of describing a noun by an adjective? Like a participle. Okay. One of the challenging things about participles is that they are adjectives, so they can have endings that correspond to any noun case. So you have to figure out what noun it goes with in the sentence by figuring out what case it is. So we're going to do a couple of samples here. What case is the participle in this example sentence that I just gave you? The chair, having been moved, blocked the door. The noun is sella, the participle is mota. You have a grid on your screen. If mota, the participle, is nominative, you're going to move your dot to the upper left. If it's genitive, upper right. Dative, lower left. Accusative, lower right. So just drag your dot based on what case you think the participle is. Nominative, right. The chair is the subject of the sentence, so the participle that describes it will also be nominative. Let's try another example. At her birthday, we gave endless praise to my mother, having been loved for years. Your participle is amatai. It's describing mother, who in the Latin would be matri. You have to figure out what case it is. If it's nominative, upper left, genitive, upper right, dative, lower left, accusative, lower right. See if you can drag your dot to the right case. Good, dative. because praise was given to her. She's the indirect object there. Good. Okay, one quick nota bene for you. A fourth principal part, perfect passive participle, will never, ever, ever, ever have a form of the verb to be next to it. In fact, on the flip side, if a fourth principal part has a form of the verb to be next to it, it will not be a participle. It will be part of the perfect passive system. It will be an actual verb that has a subject. So be aware when you're looking at a fourth principal part, what's around it. The rule works both ways. If the fourth principal part is alone, then it's definitely a participle. If the fourth principal part has sum es est, eram eras erat, ero eris erit, then it's definitely not a participle and it's definitely a verb. Okay, so the two situations are mutually exclusive. All right, how well do you think you currently understand perfect participles? You can drag your dots. Okay, good. Good, I appreciate that a lot of you used it as an actual scale, and you didn't just sort of go to the absolute, like, yes or no. Great. Good, good, good. Any questions so far? All right. We will end our session there. Whoops.